This is a divisive Genesis album, described by the Chicago Tribune as a formless blob of synth sounds. But is it really that bad? The tracks on Calling All Stations has been described by AllMusic as long, dense and lugubrious, but nevertheless it positively gleans, given that immaculate, pristine production polish that very much defined the band's pop years with Collins. And therein lies the rub, as far as I'm concerned. This album is like the proverbial mule that sits between two bales of hay and effectively starves to death under the weight of its own indecision, falling between two stools, so to speak, to mix my metaphors, trying to capitalise on the glory of the aforementioned pop years, whilst at the same time doffing a cap to its proggier sensibilities. This is the iceberg with which this album collides. And this grating is something that's been picked up by Rolling Stone magazine when they described it as a Mike and the Mechanics art rock album. The problem is Ray Wilson's voice isn't suited to pop. His voice is quite well suited to the more languid, synthesised prog settings of this record. See, I feel this record could have been terrible, but it could have been incredible as well. And the Genesis faithful didn't exactly wrap their arms around it. They all just became a bit of a pouty puss. I think the moral to be gleaned from this is trying to please everybody. Ultimately, you please nobody. So I don't see this album as necessarily bad, but I do see it as a missed opportunity. Of course, this album was released 1 year after Collins announced that he was vacating the drum stool as well as walking away from the microphone. And that terrific blue-eyed soul of his, that powerful voice that very much defined Genesis from about 76 onwards, was suddenly no more. And we all sort of wondered kind of which direction this band were going to go in, as we were left contemplating the fact that and then there were two, so to speak. Many Genesis fans, I think at the time, were highly sceptical and still remain so, unwilling to give this album a fair listen. Ray Wilson, of course, was the ex-singer of Stiltskin who were propelled to fame and glory on the back of a Levi's advert. But he was a distinctively odd choice in some respects if Genesis were going to pursue the line that they had taken on the previous 2 or 3 albums. And also an odd choice, really, to rub shoulders there with Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford, as one critic has pointed out. The ex-public school softly spoken practitioners of traditional English reserve on one hand, and Wilson, a brash working-class lad from Scotland, on the other. And I'm not sure I agree with that assessment anyway, because Hackett and Collins weren't from the cloistered world of Charterhouse, that world of tweed, crumpets and ritualised buggery. But Wilson had a great voice, gorgeous phrasing as well. He wasn't a kind of a soul belter, but nevertheless his voice had that almost Gabriel-esque purr, if you'll excuse the comparison, or a rather Michael Stipe-like enigmatic murmur. But nevertheless his voice was suited to a more reflective, introspective sound, rather than the high-gloss bombast of the previous 2 albums. I think in this case it really was a case of squeezing the proverbial square peg into the proverbial round hole. The album did not do well in the subsequent tour. Of course, the US leg of the tour was cancelled, and any plans to make a second album were subsequently scrapped, and then there were none. Which is a real shame, because I for one would like to see a version of Genesis organised around Ray Wilson on vocals, Banks, Rutherford and Hackett, and of course Phil Collins' son on drums. But I suspect I'm just drifting off to prog la-la land here. But even those Genesis stalwarts, Banks and Rutherford, seem to be somewhat muted in terms of their endorsements of this album, damning with faint praise perhaps. One merely described the album as okay, and one insisting that it turned out pretty well. As a listener, I was waiting for the conjunctive add-on, considering this band couldn't tell their Isle of Plenty from their undertow. I think this album turned out pretty well. The track Congo was my first exposure to this album, as I imagine it was with the rest of you. It all seemed a little bit too much. It was very politically on message. But, you know, from these middle-class, middle-aged public school boys, really, all chinos and gelled hair, I gave the album a cursory listen and just decided to park it, quite frankly. But it's recently I've had a lot of needling from subscribers of this channel saying I really must give this album another go, so that's exactly what I've done, well, for this video as well. On this album we get 11 tracks. It comes in about 67 minutes of music. There's absolutely no filler on it, I think, I'll give it that. And there's some excellent passages. The album grabs our attention from the get-go, I think, with that crunching guitar riff of the title track. Very moody, dramatic opening with that Collins-esque drum sound as well, all wrapped up in that soaring chorus. Congo is much better than I remember it, and there are other tracks like A Small Talk, If That's What You Need, There Must Be Some Other Way. These are all listenable numbers and are no weaker than some of the tracks on the later Genesis albums. Some of those albums weren't particularly replete with classics either. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Genesis 1983 album, but that's an album that contained Illegal Alien. I'll say no more. Calling All Stations sounds great, in my opinion. There are some nice moments on this album. Of course, it's not up there with Trick of the Tail or Foxtrot, but I think it holds its own against an album like Abacab or We Can't Dance, undoubtedly, in my opinion. When we speak of this album, we must reference the wonderful textures and atmospheres that are explored by Tony Banks' excellent keyboard work on this record. Although as I listen, I keep hoping it's going to darken and become more brooding, but instead this album chooses to search for hooks instead. And another issue I have with this album is the production. I don't think the production is as dynamic as it should be. It all becomes a bit of a splurge, really, like prog wallpaper. Shipwrecked is a great piece on this album, but I think the highlight of this record is The Dividing Line. Much better live as well. When a band like Genesis explore these longer pieces, they can break that mold of verse, chorus, solo, verse, chorus, so to speak, and really explore. And this is where this band really rises to the occasion. And as I said, The Dividing Line runs in at 8 minutes. There's some beautiful musical explorations on it. And the keyboards, not only on this track, but on this album generally, are particularly striking. The lyrics of One Man's Fall seems to explore the dangers of extremism or religious extremism. Quite pertinent, really, considering this album predates 9/11. But I can't help but feel the track ambles a little bit. In fact, Tony Banks said of this one, the first half of the song was good, but the second half suffered. If Phil had been there, I just know he would have just taken off and gone somewhere else. Alien Afternoon is a number that doesn't particularly start off well as far as I'm concerned, but it really picks up around about the midpoint, and I love the chorused voices on this one. Not About Us has similarities to the track Snowbound on the band, and then there were three. We get emotive lyrics about fading photographs and fading memories. I often wonder if Mike Rutherford had a hand in writing this one. I suspect he did. I wouldn't rank this album that highly in the Genesis discography. I mean, many would argue that it's emblematic of everything that's wrong with Genesis without Gabriel, and maybe those that might say it's emblematic of everything that's wrong with Genesis without Collins, and some that might just say it's emblematic of everything that's wrong with Genesis. And I'll repeat what I said earlier, this album is a bit of a missed opportunity. It's lacking in personality, for want of a better word. Lacking in Collins, I guess. Well, you've been watching an episode of Is It Really That Bad? A series of videos where we get to right wrongs and discuss albums that at the time they were released were much maligned. Do leave a comment, do click like, subscribe. Please check that notification bell as it makes all the difference. And check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. Anyway, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is, as you know, hope you're well, staying safe, and more importantly, that you keep listening.